Good morning and welcome to the Point. This morning you'll get the perspective from Washington and Lansing about what's going on in the new legislative session in both cities. We start with U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow talking to us about the current condition in Washington, D.C. Senator, the last time we talked was in your office. Well, we've talked since then. The last time we talked face-to-face was in your office just prior to the inauguration. And there were a lot of unanswered questions. Now, here we are, 2 months past that. There's still a lot of unanswered questions. But give me your take on Washington, this administration, President Trump so far.
Well, it's been a very tough start. I reached out to them immediately when he was talking about Buy America, Hire America, because that's my thing, and my Bring Jobs Home Act, which closes loopholes to make sure we're using, American manufacturing and so on. Haven't heard back yet, but I've said let's work together on that, as well as rebuilding America, infrastructure, making sure that we're creating good-paying American jobs. But we've seen just a very slow start. Honestly, the whole serious overview on what's happening on Russia has been something that has certainly had a lot of people very concerned. But from my standpoint, I just look at everything through the lens of Michigan, how to make do everything we can to create jobs and support our quality of life in Michigan. So I'll work with anyone. I certainly want to work with the administration if they're willing to do things that make sense for us.
I want to get back to Buy American in a few minutes, but you mentioned Russia. General Flynn has said that he would be willing to testify in the Russia situation if he gets immunity.
Right.
Is that a deal that senators can make?
I think the Intelligence Committee, which in the Senate is working in a very important bipartisan way, needs to make that decision. Overall, what we know is that Russia wants to undermine not only our democracy, which is the biggest and the best, but European democracies. They start by the election process, then the press, the CIA, undermining every part of what gives us confidence in our democracy. Why? Because Russia wants to be able to reform the Soviet Union and be the dominant force in the world. The most important thing is that we have a president who is not compromising, can in fact protect us from what's coming in terms of cyber attacks, whether it's shutting down the electric grid, financial systems, people's bank accounts, all of those things. So this is serious, and I feel confident that in the Senate, things are being done in a bipartisan way, and we'll get to the bottom of it.
Over in the House, they've got some problems. I won't ask you to weigh in on those because obviously you serve in the upper chamber. One other quick note, in that upper chamber, you will have the opportunity to weigh in on the next Supreme Court justice. And earlier this week, you, along with Senator Peters, both said you will not support the president's nominee.
That's correct.
How did you come to that decision?
Well, I've weighed this very seriously. I think it's important that he be given every respect in hearings and a vote, all of which is going to happen. But when I look at his decisions and what's best for Michigan, this is someone who came down on, against a Michigan truck driver who was at the edge of a road with brakes that had frozen up on his rig, no heat in the cab, trying to figure out what to do. Company said, don't leave the rig. Finally, after 3 hours, he could barely feel his feet, decided he had to go get help, get some heat, and so on. Came back, protected the rig, got fired. Lower courts all agreed that he should not have been fired and blackballed. Gorsuch overruled that. And when he was asked at the hearing, what would he have done if the choice was putting an unsafe rig on the road and maybe killing somebody else or the driver or freezing to death, he said he hadn't thought about it. Well, we need judges that can put themselves in the position of real people making real decisions as part of what they do as judges. So that case, as well as a special education case where he ruled in a way that was unanimously overturned by the United States Supreme Court last week as not setting the right standard for children, and so many other cases, I just don't think he's the right person for us.
Is there the possibility that we could have a court with only 8 members or maybe even fewer for the foreseeable future, given the atmosphere in Washington?
Well, there's been 8 judges for the last year because the Republican majority chose for the first time not to fill a vacancy for over the year. There's also been other times where there's been different numbers of judges. So we'll see. From my perspective, this is lifetime appointment. This should be somebody who is mainstream and can get the majority of the Senate. 7 of the 8 justices on the court today were able to get more than 60 votes in their process, so they were mainstream. And I think that should be the test. This is a lifetime appointment of somebody who's going to make decisions about a truck driver's job, about a child's education, about so many things that affect our lives.
As was said so often during the campaign, the presidency is for 4 years, the appointment to Supreme Court is for 40. So
that's right.
It's a big deal, to be sure. We'll revisit that. Let's talk about policy.
Right.
You are talking about a plan that you say would plug some loopholes in the Buy American plan. Let me see if I understand this. Right now, as it is, federal dollars being spent, defense elsewhere, are supposed to be directed towards companies that manufacture, build things, create things, employ people here in the United States. But you say there's some loopholes.
There are, and in fact, this came about, Rick, last August. I was in Grand Haven visiting RAMI, which does high-tech antennas and manufacturing and beacons for finding our pilots in the Air Force and so on. And this was part of my small business tour. And so I was over talking to them and said, how's it going? And they were telling me that one of their biggest problems is with the Department of Defense, they're competing against a foreign company, sets up a shell in the United States to win a bid, but actually makes the product overseas. So we went back and looked at it and figured out that there's been a law in the books for 80 years, long overdue to be updated, and that in fact in the last 5 years, $70 billion has gone to foreign companies that don't make the product in the United States. So we're losing jobs. So Make It in America is about saying American products first. You can't use a waiver unless you evaluate the extent to which it impacts American jobs. We should be supporting startups. If the agency says, well, we don't make it here, well, we can make anything here. So let's support startups to do the things that will make sure that when we're spending money, whether it's defense or any other agency, American tax dollars should go for American products and American jobs.
One of the things that I was unaware of until I think it was last year when you hosted something on Mackinac Island for a bunch of us and said, look, we're doing defense building all over this state. And subsequent to that, I ended up over on the east side of the state where they're building fuel tanks and other accessories for the Mars shot coming up. I mean, it's kind of remarkable to think. But federal dollars buying things for defense alone in the state are significant.
Significant. We make the Stryker. We have, I think we're the largest subcontractors for General Dynamic in the country in Michigan. A lot in West Michigan. We have in Southeast Michigan, Macomb County, what we call the Defense Corridor, that literally is business after business after business that's doing component parts for our military, whether it's vehicles, whether it's a Stryker, whether it's here with antennas and other parts, whether it's airplane parts. So this is a big part of our economy. We think of automobiles, but in defense, we're talking about all kinds of technologies and products and new clean energy products, all kinds of partnerships going on to test new things in batteries and fuel cells and so on. So where the Department of Defense chooses to do their purchasing is a big deal for us, and it really is about jobs.
Here's another big deal, and this will be bipartisan. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is something that the president has recommended be cut or eliminated.
Zeroed out
from the budget.
Yes.
$300 million, a rounding error in the federal budget. But understanding that people have spending priorities, you, your Republican colleagues, your Democratic colleagues, House and Senate in the Great Lakes states are going to put up a fight about this.
There's no question about that. And I feel a special connectedness to this because in 2010, I authored in the Budget Committee the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And since that time, I mean, this has been a bipartisan effort to make sure we have funding set aside for emergencies and things that we need to do for the Great Lakes. For instance, when we first found that there were Asian carp materials, DNA, close to Lake Michigan, because we had this fund, we could in less than a week get the Army Corps of Engineers on site figuring out what were these fish going into the water, was it birds just bringing material in from having eaten a fish, and whether we're over algae blooms on Lake Erie, whether it's runoff, water quality issues, sea lamprey, whatever it is, we don't have to wait months and months and months or a year to take action, because we've said Great Lakes are important, we're going to set aside a specific amount of money. Now, I'm encouraging people to go to my Senate website, just type in Senator Debbie Stabenow. We've got over 2,500 people engaged in this effort now. I've asked folks to share their stories, favorite memories of the Great Lakes, and there's wonderful memories that people are sharing. A lot of them remind me of my family growing up. And then we're also doing a competition, what is your favorite Great Lake? And so, but I intend to share on the floor stories from people, and we are encouraging, this is something our bipartisan Great Lakes caucus in the Senate as well as in the House is engaged in, and we've got to tell this story. People who don't live around the Great Lakes don't get it, and you know, this is really about our way of life.
And we are all but out of time, but just as a matter of looking backwards a little bit, it's not that this is a unique program. Yes, it is for the Great Lakes, but the Everglades also benefited from similar federal spending.
No
so
question.
In these unique situations,
Right.
This is not unprecedented.
You know, Everglades, Chesapeake Bay. I mean, we have special places around the country where we set up projects that focus on the challenges to that body of water or that land. And so this is no different. 20% of the world's fresh water. We need to have a way to respond to quality issues, attacks from invasive species, whatever it is, this is important.
Up next, a look at what's going on in Lansing with Democratic House member Winnie Brinks and Republican House member Brant Iden. It's next, To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. Winnie Brinks is a Democrat from Grand Rapids who serves in the House of Representatives. We talked to her about how the first quarter of this session has gone. Let's talk about this session so far. As this airs, there'll be the Easter break for the legislature, and the first 3 months kind of in the books. What has it been like with new leadership and kind of a new direction?
Well, Rick, we're off to a bit of a slow start, as you've probably noticed. We've managed to get a couple of packages of bills passed through the full House, but most of the work on those was done last term. And those are criminal justice package and the FOIA package, or the open records bills that we passed last term and then passed again this term. But other than that, the first 3 months have been notably marked by the failure of the income tax vote that the Republicans put up. Otherwise, we have a lot of work to do.
What is the lesson to be learned from your perspective when you look at that income tax vote? And for people who aren't aware, Republicans started out with one of their first initiatives. It was introduced on the first day of session that would reduce the income tax from the current 4.25 to 3.9, and thereon would have reduced income tax by 0.1% for the next 39 years until it was eliminated. That part was finally taken off. But they did vote on the rollback, and they had 12 Republican defections. They couldn't pass the bill. So what was the general feeling in the chamber about a big initiative that failed?
Well, it was very interesting to watch, of course, into the wee hours of the night while we were all there, kind of waiting to see what the Republicans would be able to do internally, and to see that kind of stack up the way it did by the end. It really kind of made people step back and question whether or not this leadership is really on its feet yet. But other than that, I think what we were hearing from our constituents was that we may be interested in tax relief, but we want you to do this right. We are very interested in making sure that you pave the roads and fix that and keep those promises that you kept. That was one of the themes that came up in the emails that I was receiving from people, and just overwhelmingly people had great concern about where the cuts would come from. And so I think that what we're seeing is a legislature that, or at least in the House, the leadership has moved pretty far to the right on this topic, and constituents are starting to be concerned that they're not really working for them and doing what they said they'd do.
Let's talk about what that kind of a rollback would be. By the way, that was a promise that was made, that the taxes would go back to 3.9% back during the Granholm administration when the tax was raised. And I remember the angst over raising taxes and should it be to 4.35 or 4.5 or wherever it was going to go. And all of the members worried about if they voted in favor of this, what it would do for them. Well, as far as I know, nobody lost their seat for raising the taxes. And it's really one of those kind of things that becomes kind of an internal struggle, I think, sometimes for members. But rolling back to 3.9% would be about $1 billion. Is that right?
I believe so, yeah.
And that would be almost all general fund money.
Right.
And the general fund budget is somewhere around $10 billion.
Right.
So it's 10%, maybe a little more than 10% of that total budget. And the general fund, I always describe, is that fund that pays for most of what we think about when it comes to government.
Exactly.
So is that kind of cut sustainable?
You know, those are serious questions that need to be answered. It's not sustainable if we intend to keep the promises to fund the roads and to help pay for Medicaid expansion, those kinds of things. If we intend to try and make college more affordable and help our higher universities pick up a piece of that tab for tuition, that helps families in our districts, right? It keeps the tuition bill down for them. So if we're going to keep those kinds of promises or move in that direction, it's really questionable whether or not this is actually a very responsible move, and I think it's not. So the problem and some of these Republicans didn't vote yes on it in part because we didn't know where those cuts were going to come from. So I think it's just sort of a bad management tactic to propose a significant cut like that without saying, this is what we are going to take away from you when we give you back a couple bucks per week. People need to know if that's a trade-off that is worth it to them. And as far as I could see, the Republicans failed to make that case.
One of the things that always happens at the first part of the year is people start talking about budgets, and the governor laid out his budget priorities. He talked about a number of different issues. The House and Senate will start working on budgeting. Tell me about that process now that you've had a chance to look at it for a number of years, and kind of where you think we are, because notwithstanding the tax conversation that we just had, Michigan's overall economy is probably in as good a shape as we have seen it in the last 15 years, 12 years, something like that, I would think.
So we're knee deep in the budget right now. We're, all budget all the time pretty much. So it's something that we're all keeping an eye on. In particular, I'm watching to make sure that we preserve some of the good things that we've been able to accomplish in the last couple of years. As you said, we're in a pretty good situation in terms of our economy. Here in West Michigan in particular, we have almost full employment. And the governor's proposed a pretty fair budget, I think. There are certain things that I wouldn't mind tweaking, but we've got a lot of opportunity there to support some good stuff that he has maintained there. So we'll continue to have conversations about that. In particular, I'm watching things like the Veterans Home budget, making sure that we're supporting that adequately and watching the changes there as they evolve into a whole new phase for them.
Well, in fact, the Veterans Home is going to be not just a new phase, but a new facility and new management style. This is kind of a sea change for something I know that you've been very concerned about.
Right, it is. And so it's really important to me that we watch, one, we need to make sure that we can secure federal funding. Of all the things in the Trump budget, we saw that veteran services was something that he valued and maintained or increased. So I'm hopeful that that money that we've got our eye on that will help the veterans in the state of Michigan will be forthcoming from the federal government, and that will help us build new facilities. But it's really important for me to keep an eye on what actually is happening inside those buildings. If you just put a pretty new shell on the outside and you don't change how we are serving our veterans at the Veterans Home, we're going to continue to have problems. So I feel it's my job to kind of be a watchdog about that and to watch for making sure that we're changing for the better the way we provide services to veterans throughout the state.
Republican Brant Iden talked to us about an interesting vote to try and reduce the income tax in the state, plus transparency. Representative, let's talk a little bit about the sunshine laws, the Freedom of Information Act. I've talked to a number of different members about this, but you actually authored some of those bills and sponsored them. They all passed with unanimous support, but their future is still pretty murky. as they move towards the Senate. Before we get to that part, let's talk about the bills you introduced.
Yeah, so I do have one bill in the package. There's about a 10-bill package that was passed unanimously through the House, all the bills, and they relate to basically the Freedom of Information Act for both the legislature and the governor's office. And this is something that we hear often in the legislature. It's probably one of the top 5 items I hear the most about is more transparency in government, folks wanting to know how their tax dollars are being spent in Lansing, and folks wanting to have access to that information. So one of the things that we did, this same bill package passed out of the House, if you recall, last year. One of the critiques we heard, though, was that we wanted to make sure that if you were contacting our office as it related to constituent relations work, that information was still being protected. I believe those protections are there this time around. I know that that's one of the critiques we've heard from the Senate, is ensuring that those protections are there. However, I'm more optimistic this time. There's recently been a couple bills that were introduced by both Senator Shoemaker and Senator O'Brien over in the Senate, and we'll see. I know that there's still a lot of skepticism, but I hope we can get there because this is really important. I mean, when you see this kind of unanimous bipartisan support, I believe that this is good legislation that needs to get done.
This continues on the transparency part
Absolutely.
of things. But in addition to the expansion of FOIA, one of the things you're working on is to bring some light to be shown on who makes what in state government. Tell me about that.
Absolutely. So I have a bill that just recently came out of committee last week, House Bill 4301, which would post public salaries online. So, and that's something that was brought to me by some constituents as well as some folks that had questions about, again, shining more light on government, knowing where those dollars are being spent, where are our tax dollars going. People want to know this information. And actually at the same time as we were going through this process, though, the Mackinac Center was also working on this. And just as of last week, they've started to release some of this information. And we're taking a look at it. I know that they had some errors when they first posted, but I know that there's some glitches, and I think that they've got it up and working. And what I've said is I'm willing to hold off on the legislation and save the taxpayer the cost of posting this if that information is already available.
My contention is that if you and I go walk down Main Street in Kalamazoo and ask 20 people what their income tax rate is for the state of Michigan, that if one of them could answer us correctly, they would be way above the average, because I don't think most people know that it's 4.25% right now. The House plan was to take it to 3.9%, and then originally it would have been a 39-year process of eliminating the income tax altogether. Leadership decided better about that and just went to the rollback from 4.25 to 3.9%, but they didn't get it done. 12 Republicans defected, and the measure was still put up for a vote, and it was defeated. What was that process like? Because as I've pointed out with other members on other shows, normally when the speaker puts something up on the board, it's with the assurance it's going to pass.
Well, I think we had a few things at play. One of the things I will definitely say was it was our first vote. It was the first vote right out of the chute with obviously a new crop of legislators that hadn't experienced the process yet.
And new leadership.
And new leadership as well, and I think that played into it. I don't think, though, that means you won't see something revisited again. I know that we continue to, as a caucus, stay focused on the fact that we want tax relief. We want everybody to start being able to put a little bit more back in their pockets. And so one of the contentions that the folks that voted no on the Republican side of the aisle had was they wanted to see where those cuts were going to come from. And I think that that's a very fair question. And it led and it's always the chicken or the egg. What do you put first? Do you put forth the tax cut first and then back into the budget, or do you do the budgeting first and then figure out what dollars you have available and then do the cut, and then do the tax rollback or tax cut? And I think that we're just going to do it the other way this time. And again, I'm not on appropriations, so I don't know quite the nuts and bolts of what that will look like. But I think that those 12 members said, okay, we'd like to see where those cuts are going to come from, and so we're going to do that first. We're going to go through the budgeting process. We're going to see where the dollars shake out, what potentially is left, and then if there's something we can do, I think the Speaker would probably continue down that path, because again, we're trying to put more money back into the taxpayers' pockets. I mean, it's their money. We want to give them we want to let them keep it.
This is the beginning of your second term.
It is.
So you've had 2 years to get a sense for what this body is like. What is the first part of this session, because as this airs, we're in a 2-week break, spring break, Easter break, and so the first quarter has passed. What has it been like over there? Because my observations have it's looked as though it's a little unsettled.
I think that's from when you look at it from an outsider's perspective. I think that's the definitely what you first have a tendency to say you're seeing. But again, it comes back to new leadership, new members, and it just takes time. I mean, I remember it wasn't that long ago when I was a freshman coming in, and I remember just the learning curve that it takes to understand the process, start to build those relationships, and I think you're starting to see some of that. It'll get more settled as things roll on, and as we get through this in-district work period and we get back at things, you're going to see things just start to click. More bills are starting to come out of committee. More votes are starting to go up on the board. Folks are starting to get more, relaxed and comfortable with the process, and I think that's just what it takes. I think that you saw a little bit of that with the income tax vote, simply because it was our first vote. But now I think you'll start to see that once we get into the stride, things will start working well.
We'll be back with more To the Point. So lawmakers from Lansing to Washington have their work cut out for them, and so do we, as we keep an eye on what they've done during the previous week when you join us every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock on Wood TV 8 for To the Point.